Hi there, students. This is Mr. Verzette. Today let's talk about value drawing, how to make things look realistic, and more specifically, the pressure scale. Now you guys already know about the value scale, and this goes back to basics, similar to when I taught you guys the overhand hold and the writing detail hold for drawing with your pencil. Well, the same concept applies, and in order to draw realistically, this is one of the concepts you need to know. So what is the pressure scale? Well, let's take a look at this picture right down here. It breaks it down pretty detailed. For starters, I break pressure into four areas. Pressures 1, 2, 3, and 4. Pressure 1 represents the lightest pressure on your pencil. I mean, it's as if you were just holding your pencil from the very back and just lightly caressing the paper with the pencil tip. It's the lightest feather touch, lightest graze that you can even achieve on the paper. All right. Next up would be pressure 2, which is comparable or similar to as if you were to write your name or write a sentence using a pencil. So you're pushing down just hard enough to get an even gray. After that, we've got pressure 3, which is if you're pushing really hard on your pencil. That's if you really want to get something really dark and bold on your piece. And then finally, pressure 4 is when your lead breaks and we never use it. Those are just your guidelines. So how does this apply to drawing realistically? Well, it is very important to understand how hard you need to push, where, when, and why. Pressure is the second half of understanding how to make things look realistic. So throughout the entire process of creating a drawing, this applies to you guys because when you pre-draw, you always pre-draw at pressure 1. Pre-drawings need to be as light as the lightest value that you plan on using in your piece. Next, consider pressure 2 a mid-tone. Now some people push harder than others. I know that I've seen some students when they write their name, they're pushing it at pressure 3. Just kind of gauge it. Kind of go for the in-between between pushing really hard with your pencil and almost not at all. Now when you're layering in your shade, your darker values, that's where you go to pressure 3. And finally, textures and details such as fur, wrinkles, or speckles, or any other type of an effect that you have in your piece are usually added on top of all of that layering that you've done. And so in some areas where you're in the highlight, you might be using a step up in intensity in order to get a fur texture. In some areas, such as a mid-tone, you might want to go a step up to a pressure 3 to get certain fur textures, for example. Okay, let's look at this rabbit, and first of all, look and see where different pressures were used, and also when it comes down to textures and fur, what pressures were used. So, as you can see, these really, really light areas, that's where I barely even touched the piece with my pencil. I was very, very light. The lightest, of course, are the highlights, where there is no lead whatsoever, but those don't count. Pressure 2 would be if I were to push down as if I were writing a sentence. Those areas are right near the eye, for example, over here in the other part of the arm. And remember, your mid-tone is the true value or the true color of what your form would look like in natural light. And finally, pressure 3, darkest areas. Pretty simple, huh? It's really not that complicated. Here's where it gets a little weird. If I wanted to do fur in this pressure 1 area, right here on the forehead, in order to even have my strokes visible, I would need to push harder than I did to lay that initial value down, right? So naturally, I would increase it up a step. Now, it doesn't have to be all the way to a pressure 2. Remember, the more values you have, the more realistic your piece looks. You might go for a 1 1/4, 1 1/2, pressure 1 3/4. There's an infinite amount of in-between there that you can reach. So, for example, in this light area, in order to get kind of a furry texture, I just push slightly harder with my pencil in order to get that fur. You can kind of see over here where we've got on top of the forehead, light fur, and it gets progressively darker. So you need to have all those in-betweens in order to get those really cool values. Pressure 3, what do? How do you get fur textures in a pressure 3? Well, you really can't. Pressure 3 represents as hard as you can push without breaking your lead. So if you're going to get fur texture, really the only way you could do it would be either to go in and erase with like a really teeny tiny eraser, or just plan your highlights around where you're shading your shades at. But let's take a look and see how we can get some textures still using a pressure 3. Let's look right here underneath the chin. There's fur texture there. I just pulled that pressure 3 into out into the lighter areas. And so it made it look kind of like fur. So once again, basic tenets of value drawing, you use your shadows in order to draw forms and use your shadows to define the things around them. Here's a non-example of a lack of attention to the pressure scale. without attention to pressure, it's kind of like brain surgery using a pipe wrench. You really need to have control over what you're doing. And for some of you who are learning this for the first time, in order to achieve that control, you'll need to think a lot and really concentrate hard on what you're doing. And it might take you a while to get to the point where you do it naturally. But if you're mindful of your pressure, mindful of what you're doing, and mindful of trying to achieve control over what you're doing, you'll definitely avoid this kind of slop. And mainly you're probably thinking, Mr. V, I already know this. I know that in order to get light values I have to push light, and dark values I have to push dark. Well, to be honest, it does apply to other areas. For example, when you're going to blend your values together without using a blending stick, just your pencil, then you'll need to be mindful of how hard you need to push to get in between those values. Likewise, when we go on to colored pencil, pressure is even more in-depth. It's very important that you apply pressure to how you work. And let's just take a look at an example of how it'll apply in the future using color, because, after all these concepts pass forward. This is an example of gradual change from a dark value to a light value, here on the very topmost strip in red. Now, below is an example of pressure 1, below that pressure 2, and finally 3. This applies to colored pencil drawing. This is how it's going to work for you guys in the future. As you can see, we've got a picture of kind of like a little ribbon or a flower petal here. And we've got P1, P2, P3. We also have highlight, midtone, and shade values already mapped out. This is blocking in your values, which you've seen in other screencasts. But as you can see, this breaks down how hard you're going to have to push in order to shade this flower petal. And if you look down a little bit lower beneath it, right there, you've got a value drawing in red, just like you would draw a flower petal sort of form thingamajig using gray pencil lead. There's no difference, except here. If we scroll down a little bit, I'm going to teach you how to get realistic shadows in color. And the secret to that, I'm not going to tell you yet, but you need to know why you pushed hard in some areas. And in those certain areas, that's where you push down with that other color in order to get this kind of an effect. And it's the secret to making all these cool little ripples and ridges and folds in this flower petal to making them look real. We're going to be doing that later on in second semester. So all the stuff that you're learning now is going to apply then as well. So it's pretty much a concept that we've been doing already. We're just adding words to it now. But be mindful of it. Be aware of your pressure. You'll hear me in class make mention of these tools. For example, I'll say, okay, everybody, go and in this area, if you want a good highlight, do a pressure 1 and then layer in a pressure 2 up to a 3 in order to get some good contrast. You'll hear that terminology, and it's important that you know where it's coming from so that we're all on the same page. So I look forward to seeing you in class, and take care.